Chapter 1811. Maggie grabbed her hand away, broke her own hand free, and lifted her gaze. "Don't we have you to thank for all this, Miss Livingston?" Zenobia froze in place, and her blood was drained away from her cheeks until they gradually paled and dimmed. Maggie looked at her. "You're too bumptious and presumptuous. All young Master Knowles wants is to make it clear to you that he can drag the Livingstons down without the help of any foreign power. And he doesn't need to get rid of the Livingstons completely. All he needs to do is replace the leader of the Livingstons, which is more than enough to change everything. Now that Mr. Livingston is going to prison, the position of the leader of the Livingstons has been passed on. The vice president is in power now and has the people's support. At least half of your and your father's power in the Livingstons has been taken away by your uncle. How does that feel?" Zenobia covered her forehead and shouted hysterically, "I refuse to believe it. You're lying to me." Maggie smirked disdainfully. "Believe it or not, this is all true. And Ms. Livingston, I wish you a happy trip back to Hanniston." Zenobia slumped on the floor as if she were an empty shell without a soul. 2 days later, at the college. After the drama, theater, and film department's assessment results came out, they were published on the notice board. Daisy and Freya fought through the crowd. Sure enough, Daisy saw her name on the list. Freya turned her head. "Victoria College's drama, theater, and film department's top student, you're amazing, Daisy." Daisy chuckled. "I still have to wait until I get good grades in my graduation exams and my thesis." "Are you going to graduate soon?" Freya was dumbfounded. Daisy choked on her own words. She had forgotten she had not told Freya that she was planning to graduate early. Now that she could no longer hide it from her, she scratched her cheeks and nodded. "I only want to graduate soon." Freya suddenly realized something. It turns out that someone wants to get engaged to Knowles as soon as possible. Daisy's cheeks warmed up instantly. She bumped her arm with her elbow and whispered, "What are you talking about?" At that moment, Freya's cell phone rang. She took it out, took a glimpse at the screen, and her expression dimmed immediately. "Who's that?" Daisy noticed something, took a glance at the caller ID inadvertently, and saw that it was her father. Freya did not answer the call and placed the phone back into her bag. "Something just came up. I'll have to go first." Daisy was worried. "Do you want me to accompany you back?" Freya looked at her. "Nah, I can resolve this myself." Looking at the figure that was walking away, thoughts flashed across Daisy's mind. Daisy walked back to the dormitory alone until she received a call from Knowles. Her heart skipped a beat, and she answered the call immediately. "Knowles? It's been such a long time, do you miss me?" His voice sounded as deep and pleasant as usual. Daisy snorted lightly as if she was a little angry. "What's the use of missing you? At the end of the day, I don't get to see you in person." He chuckled. "Then you should turn around." She froze in place and turned around in surprise. The figure standing under the begonia tree not far away looked breathtakingly impeccable and familiar at the same time. It seemed that he had come here straight from the airport, and he did not even have time to change his clothes. A petal fluttered down from the begonia tree and landed on his shoulder. Daisy put the phone down, took 2 steps forward, then ran straight toward him and threw herself into his arms. The warm, firm embrace signified that he was the real deal. Knowles hugged her in his arms and rested his chin on the top of her head. "Daisy Vanderbilt, did you miss me?" Daisy buried herself in his chest and sulked. "What took you so long?" Knowles lifted her face with his palm and rubbed her cheeks with his fingertips, and a profound and hoarse voice sounded. "Sorry, I've kept you waiting for such a long time. But I'm back now." Chapter 1812. Knowles lowered his head and pressed his lips against hers. That was what he had been thinking about day and night. Daisy wrapped her arms around his neck, and the two hugged and caressed each other under the begonia tree. The two figures were inseparable until the moment the two lips separated. Daisy lowered her gaze, her eyelashes flickered, and the emotions that surged from the bottom of her eyes rippled. We've been apart for half a month. He gave off a chuckle, and his lips landed on her forehead this time around. Yeah, it's been half a month, she whispered. Don't you have anything to say to me? Nolace rubbed his fingers over her lips and whispered, yes. He approached her, and she was only inches away from him. You haven't been by my side, and that made me miss you so much that I actually dreamed of you. Daisy's cheeks turned warm. She avoided his gaze and said in a stern voice, that level of glibness. But she could not help but wonder. What did you dream about me? He smiled and approached her ear. I dreamed that I swallowed you whole. Daisy was so furious that she beat him. I'm serious. He grabbed her hand and kissed the back of her hand. I want to own every inch of you. What's not serious about that? Daisy's cheeks flushed, like a ripe apple, making it difficult for him to suppress his urge to take a bite at her. But Nolace did not care and bit her lips lightly. She hissed as the pain felt numbing and strange. She protested in a low voice, Nolace Knowles. You're not allowed to bite me. His eyes overflowed with hilarity. Freya stepped into the home she had not returned to in ages. Nothing had changed at home except that it felt a lot more deserted. The butler went upstairs to report, and Brandon hurried downstairs after a while. Faye, you've finally come back to have a look. Freya did not plan to catch up with them. You're the one who called me here. Just tell me what you want from me. Brandon knew that she did not plan to forgive them from the bottom of her heart, but he did not blame her. Faye, it's been such a long time. At least go upstairs and take a look at your mother. She did not say anything. Brandon lowered his head. I know you resent her a lot deep down, but since your brother died, your mother's mental condition has been very bad. You're the only one she has left. I'm the only one she has left? Freya looked at her father. Ken's death was all her fault. Am I the reason that she's heartbroken? Ken is the only person that she cares about from the beginning to the end, isn't it? Faye. Father, I told you that since Mother doesn't want me around, you don't need to try to patch my relationship with her. If it's really doable, why would you have to wait until today to do so? Brandon choked on his own words, and his expression dimmed. You've summoned me here to see her, but does she want to see me? Her mood might even worsen when she sees me. Freya turned around and was about to leave. Brandon stopped her. Faye, what if your mother wants to see you? She stopped. In the bedroom upstairs, Sandy was sitting on the bed. Ever since Ken died, she did not even bother to dress herself up, so she looked in a daze and had lost a lot of weight. Freya and Brandon walked into the room, and he came to the bedside. Faye has come to see you. Sandy moved, lifted her gaze, stared at Freya, stretched out her hand, and moved her dry lips. Faye. Freya took a deep breath and walked over. Sandy held her tightly. Her haggard expression and the vicissitudes of life seemed to have sanded her usual arrogance down. Faye, you've come to see me. You haven't forgotten about me, have you? When looking at her mother's appearance, it would be fake for her to say that she did not feel soft-hearted for a split second. She lowered her gaze and said, Mother, please let go of me first. Sandy grabbed onto her arm and refused to let go. Faye, you're the only one who can help me now. Can you do your mother a favor? I know that your grandfather has recognized you. As long as you can obtain your grandfather's recognition, I'll be able to count on you in the future. Chapter 1813. Freya's back stiffened, and the empathy that had just sprouted in her heart was immediately strangled to death by her mother's words. Brandon was also stunned. He wanted to pull Sandy away, but was pushed aside by her. She looked extremely morbid as she raised her voice hysterically. Faye, you're my only hope now. You can't leave me behind. I'm your mother. The sound of a slap resounded in the bedroom. Freya was not able to react to the abrupt movement at all, and all she saw was Sandy falling onto the bed. The scene was immediately followed by Brandon's wrath. Haven't you had enough? Sandy covered her cheeks, froze on the bed, and did not utter a single word. Brandon took a deep breath. What did you promise me? You promised that you'd get along with Faye. Were you lying to me? With his bloodshot eyes, he gnashed his teeth. You've killed your son, is that still not enough for you to learn a lesson? And now you're planning to reach out to your daughter? What's the power and status that you've been fighting for? Why didn't the king take you and Ken in? Don't you have any self-awareness? What kind of mother would use her child as a tool to fight for power? Your son's death is on you. It's not me. It's not, Sandy trembled. She looked stupefied and sorrowful. Sandy could not accept the fact that Ken had died. These words were tantamount to a lifelong punishment. The person that felt the guiltiest was Brandon. Because of his cowardice, he had failed to stop Ken from taking the path of no return. Freya looked away expressionlessly. Father, since Mother doesn't look too well mentally, you should take her for treatment as soon as possible. Brandon stared at a corner in the room. He looked absent-minded and did not speak for a long time. Freya turned around. I'll go back first. Leaving the Pruitt Manor, she stopped outside the yard with a dejected expression. This home has long since shattered into pieces. I actually had a trace of expectation just now. That's hilarious. On the other side of the city, at the Knowles mansion, Diana could not help but cry when she saw her son arrive home in one piece. Rick hurriedly hugged her. Darling, why are you crying all of a sudden? I thought we'd never see our son again. Diana leaned on his shoulder and covered her face with a handkerchief. I only have one son. How can I get myself a daughter-in-law if I lose my son now? Rick was rendered speechless. So, this is it? Daisy lowered her head and could not hold back her smile. Mrs. Knowles has gone a little overboard with her acting. Knowles rubbed the bridge of his nose. Mother, was that enough to cover your daily dose of acting? Diana sobbed. Don't you dare call me your mother. I almost lost my mind worrying about you. For God's sake, what kind of child have I given birth to? He doesn't even care about his own safety at all. Knowles lowered his gaze. I promise this incident won't repeat itself again. Does that mean that you are planning to repeat this in the future? Diana smashed the handkerchief on him. Let me warn you, Knowles, if you ever dare to act like this again, I'll bring your future wife with me and run away from home. Rick and Knowles were both rendered speechless. Daisy walked up to Diana's side and whispered, Mrs. Knowles already knows that he's wrong, so don't blame him anymore. Diana covered the back of her hand, stopped crying, and said earnestly, Daisy, you can't spoil him like this. This young man will only get more disobedient the more you let him do as he likes. The corners of Daisy's lips twitched. Rick could not bear listening to Diana's complaints anymore and said sourly, all right, if you really want to spend time with your future daughter-in-law that much, you should just go with her. I'm no longer important to you, am I? Then I should just leave this place. He turned around and went upstairs. Dear Rick Knowles. You stop right there. Diana did not expect her husband to be jealous of his future daughter-in-law. How can he still be so childish at this age? But what could she say at this moment? She could only go upstairs to coax him. Chapter 1814. Only Daisy and Knowles were left in the living room. Daisy probed upstairs. Is Mr. Knowles really angry? Knowles stood up. Don't worry. My mother can handle it. He stopped, reached out, and took her into his arms. Daisy was stunned and looked up at him. What are you doing? With his fingertips, he tucked the hair that was hanging over her forehead to the back of her ear. Would you like to go back to my room? She looked away subconsciously, feeling extremely nervous. What will we do after we go back into your room? Knowles lowered his head and bit her ear gently. I want to stay with you. She felt an electric jolt up her spine, her cheeks felt flushed and warm, and she swallowed her saliva with difficulty. aren't staying with you now? This is different. He ran his finger over her lips. I want to kiss you, but if you're not afraid of being seen. Daisy covered his mouth with her palm, her ears were on the brink of lighting on fire, and she whispered, okay, I know. As soon as she stepped into the room, Knoles pushed her against the wall, pinched her chin, and kissed her. After a while, Daisy's eyelashes trembled, and her hands that were resting on his shoulders clenched tightly. Knoles. I can't breathe. Knoles placed his palm on her lower back and buried his head on the side of her neck. The breath he exhaled seemed to be scorching every inch of her skin. Daisy's legs felt weak, and she almost lost her footing, but he picked her up in the next second before she could react to anything. Knowles, without giving her a chance to speak up, he sealed her lips again. As dusk approached, the setting sun poured into the house through the French windows, and the light and shadow on the head of the bed softened his facial outline like a photo filter. Daisy lay sideways right next to Knoles, staring at him, who was asleep, and could not help but raise her hand to caress his eyelashes. Knoles frowned slightly, lifted his hand, grasped her wrist, and pressed it against his chest. He did not open his eyes, and chuckled. I've finally fallen asleep, and you've woken me up again. Daisy pouted. You can sleep as much as you want, whenever you want, why must you keep me here? He just wouldn't let me go. If Mrs. Knowles were to see that we're on the same bed, she'd definitely misunderstand us. Knoles turned over, his arm landed horizontally across her waist, and he hugged her in a solid embrace. Because it feels safe when you're by my side. She nestled in his arms and did not utter a single word. Forget it. Since he's so sleepy, I'll just lay here and be his blanket. However, drowsiness was something very contagious, so it did not take long for Daisy to fall asleep next to him. Knoles woke up and saw the person who was sleeping even more soundly than him in his arms. He could not help but chuckle. This girl is really trustful and unwary when she's around me. He leaned forward, pecked her gently on her forehead, then sat up, covered her with the blanket, left the room quietly, and went downstairs. Diana was asking the servants to prepare dinner. Thus, he went into the kitchen and instructed, Mother, get them to prepare more food for dinner. She turned around and stared at Knoles. Is Daisy coming over for dinner tonight? Knoles cleared his throat. She didn't even go home. Diana was stunned by the response, returned to her senses in the next second, and asked, Daisy didn't go back, then where is? She's in my room. Diana was shocked when she heard that answer, stepped forward immediately, and grabbed him by the collar. Knowles, Daisy hasn't even graduated from college. Knoles rubbed his forehead. I know, don't let your imagination run wild. Then what is she doing in your room? Sleeping. Diana was exasperated. And here you are, trying to explain this situation to me. Why didn't you restrain yourself? Daisy is a pure, innocent little girl, and you've taken her. Knoles glanced at her. Do you think your son is a beast? Diana thought about it carefully. Yes, I should know him better. After all, he's my son. No matter how much he likes Daisy, he won't sweet talk her into doing those things. Chapter 1815. The next day, Daisy arrived at the college with no energy. She had slept in Knoles' room throughout the whole afternoon yesterday. Thus, she was an insomniac when she returned to the villa in the evening and could not fall asleep until 5 in the morning. She could not help but take out a small mirror and take a look at her own reflection in the mirror. Her eye bags and dark circles were that close to turning her into a panda. Suddenly, someone tapped her on the shoulder. She turned her head in fright and was stunned. Colton? Colton crossed his arms and looked at her dark circles. Did you go out and become a thief last night? You're the thief here, sneaking up on me like that. Daisy turned her face away and explained herself with a lie. I drank too much coffee and couldn't sleep last night. Where's Freya? Daisy paused for a split second and stared at him with a puzzled expression. Why would you want to know that? It's nothing. Colton looked away with an unchanged expression, but he still felt inappropriate, so he added, "There's something that I need her help with." "What's that? Why are you asking so many questions today?" Daisy was rendered speechless. She bulged her cheeks as if she was thinking about something, a hint of slyness then flashed across her eyes, and she speculated with a smirk, "Colton, you don't actually hate Freya, do you?" Colton frowned. "What? I'm not blind. You used to want me to stay as far away as I could from her, but when did you and Freya get so close?" "He's been looking for Freya so frequently lately. Something smells fishy." Colton laughed out of fury, raised his hand, and rubbed her hair vigorously. "You've grown up, huh? How dare you speculate on me?" He messed up Daisy's hair, so she pushed him away and tidied it up. "No one's speculating on you. That's just a fact." "Colton, is it so difficult for you to admit that you don't hate Freya?" Colton turned his face away and took a deep breath. "That's not your business. Freya is my friend." "How is that not my business?" Daisy approached him and said with a smirk, "Colton, Freya is actually quite a girl, isn't she? Look, even Waylon doesn't hate her." "You shut up." Daisy was stunned for a few seconds. Why would Colton react so strangely as soon as I brought up Waylon? She stretched out her hand and jerked the hem of his sleeve. "Colton, did you argue with Waylon?" "No." Colton covered his cheeks with his palms and calmed himself down. He then turned around and said, "I'm heading to class already." Daisy stood on the spot, staring at Colton's figure as he walked away, rubbing her chin in thought. Freya did not come to the college today, so Daisy tried to call her. The call went through after a long wait, and Freya's voice sounded hoarse and weak. "Freya, are you all right?" "I'm fine." She coughed. "It's just a cold. Don't worry about me. I'm only taking a day off." She hung up after the brief explanation. Daisy was still worried and decided to visit Freya at her residence after her classes. Meanwhile, Freya took a nap after the phone call. After a while, she woke up from the nap but was still feeling weak and uncomfortable. She got up and propped her hands against the handrail to support her weak body as she walked downstairs to get some warm water from the kitchen. Hearing the doorbell ringing, Freya put the mug down and walked to open the door. Just as she arrived at the door, her consciousness faded out gradually, and she collapsed on the floor. Standing at the door, Daisy heard the commotion coming from the other side of the door and shouted, "Freya?" She kept ringing the doorbell, but there was still no response. Daisy realized that something had gone wrong and quickly looked around to see what she could find. She climbed over the balcony, and fortunately, the window was not locked. Daisy managed to get herself into the living room through the window and saw Freya lying behind the door. "Freya!" She stepped forward, helped her up, and placed her hand over her forehead. It was scorchingly hot. Daisy quickly took out her cell phone, flipped through her contact list, and called Waylon. "Waylon, Freya has a high fever. Come to her place now." Chapter 1816. Freya lay on the hospital bed with 4 drips while Daisy sat by her side until she slowly woke up. Daisy got up and asked, "Freya, are you all right?" Freya forced a smile. "Yeah, thanks." Daisy sat back down. "I was so worried. I'm glad I went to see you, or nobody would know that you fainted. You would have fried your brain with that fever." Freya pushed herself up. "Did you send me to the hospital?" Daisy replied, "I got Waylon to drive us over." Freya didn't say anything back. Waylon showed up and leaned against the door, then knocked. "Feeling better?" Freya paused and nodded. "Sorry for the trouble." Daisy said, "There's no trouble. By the way, wasn't the nanny home?" Freya looked down and said, "She brought Didi out, and I thought I would feel better after a nap." Taking care of Didi wasn't an easy task, so Freya hadn't told the nanny she wasn't feeling well. "That won't do. Why don't you get another helper? What will happen if the nanny isn't around and the same thing happens again?" Freya smiled. Don't worry about it, I'll be careful. Daisy walked to Waylon. Why don't we send someone from our home over? Waylon looked at her. Go ahead and arrange for it. Freya was startled and immediately said, there's really no need for that. My place is too small for that many people. Don't worry, I'll tell the nanny if I'm not feeling well the next time. Daisy was going to say something when Waylon put his hand on her head. Alright, if Freya doesn't want it, don't force it. After that, he looked toward Freya. I've paid for your hospital bills. Rest well. Freya frowned but didn't know what to say. Daisy and Waylon left the room. She had to walk faster to keep up with him and asked, Waylon, did you get into an argument with Colton? Waylon paused, then turned to look at her. Why do you ask? Daisy scratched her face. Colton seems weird today. I think he got angry when I mentioned you. Waylon squirted. What did you mention about me? Daisy replied honestly, I said you don't hate Freya. Waylon chuckled and turned to face her. Daisy, why do you think Colton is angry? Daisy pouted. How would I know? Waylon smiled, knocked her head gently, and left. Think about. Daisy was annoyed because she wouldn't have asked him if she could figure it out. That afternoon, Freya walked out of the main doors of the hospital. A car parked in front of her, blocking her way. The window lowered, and Colton was in the driver's seat. Freya asked with a frown, Why are you here? Colton looked at her and said, I came to see if you died of a fever. Freya knew nothing good would come out of his mouth, so she smiled. Are you disappointed then? He said, maybe. She turned to leave when Colton called out to her, Hold on. She turned around. Yes? Colton motioned as he said, Get in. Seeing how she didn't move, he got a little impatient. Are you deaf? Do I need to repeat myself? Freya stood next to the door because she saw how he had a temper. She pressed the car horn and yelled out, Idiot, Chapter 1817. The honk startled a passerby, who glared at them, but they couldn't hear what she yelled at him. It was different for Colton, who was in the driver's seat. He could hear it clearly, and his face turned dark. Freya Pruitt. Colton opened the door, grabbed her wrist, and gnashed his teeth. What did you call me? She wouldn't escape and couldn't break free of his grip. Her wrist started hurting from being grabbed too hard, so she yelled, Let go of me. Colton grabbed her chin and leaned closer. Say it again. He sounded threatening. Freya stopped struggling and chuckled. Are you going to hit me again? Colton laughed maniacally. I never hit you. He paused and didn't continue. He had lost control the previous time, but he didn't hit her. You wouldn't remember something so menial. Freya pulled her hand away and rubbed her wrist. I'm going to leave if you have nothing more to say. I wouldn't want to be an eyesore. She tried to walk away, but Colton blocked her with his arm. I'll drive you. Freya paused and looked surprised. She turned to look at him. And asked, Are you all right? Colton put his hand on the door and looked at her. I don't want you to faint on the way back. You'll make my sister worry. Freya paused for a few seconds, pushed him away, and walked over to the passenger's seat. Thanks. She wasn't embarrassed. Freya looked out the window during the journey and noticed that he slowed down and wasn't driving dangerously like the other night. She would suspect that he was a different person if it weren't for his face and annoying personality. Colton looked at her through the corner of his eyes. Why are you staring? Freya choked and laughed. How do you know that I'm looking at you? I might be looking at something else. You have a lot to see on your side. There's not much to see on the driver's side. People who were in the passenger's seat would rarely look toward the driver's side and would keep their eyes on their side. What else could she be looking at other than himself? Freya was rendered speechless. She would admit that she was just taking a peek at him, but he said that she was staring. That sounded like flirting. Was Freya flirting with him? He must be joking. Colton's lips curled when Freya didn't reply. The car parked in the courtyard, and when she got out, the nanny and Didi happened to get home as well. Didi sat in the tricycle with a cute blue hat. Her chubby cheeks were really adorable. She put out her hands when she saw Freya and called in a baby voice, "Auntie, Upsy." Freya walked over and picked her up. Didi put her arms around her neck and kissed her face. The nanny smiled. Didi had a lot of fun today. Really? Freya took off her hat and rubbed her head. You'll have a good night's sleep after having fun. The nanny suddenly looked toward Colton, who got out of the car and asked, "Is this your friend, ma'am?" Freya paused and noticed that Colton was still there. She was going to say something when Didi suddenly said, "Daddy." Colton didn't know what to say. Freya covered her mouth. "Didi, no, he's not your daddy." Didi put out her arms toward her and chuckled. Her cute look would melt anyone's heart. It's Daddy, chapter 1818. Didi. Freya didn't know what to do with her. Didi had never seen her parents ever since she was born, so she called anyone Daddy. Freya sighed before turning to Colton to explain, "Don't mind her. She's just a kid. Please drive safely." She was going into the house with Didi in her arms, but Didi grabbed onto his shirt. The nanny was shocked and immediately walked forward. "Didi, behave." Freya was going to stop Didi, but Colton stretched out his arms and took her over. Freya was shocked. "You." Colton hugged her, but more importantly, he knew how to carry her, and it was obvious that it wasn't his first time holding a child. Not only did Didi not cry, but she even laughed happily and started playing with his hair. Colton wasn't angry about that because he had carried children before, including Helios' daughter and his uncle's son. The children were soft, but they were really strong, adorable miniature humans. Freya seemed to have discovered a whole new world when she saw the arrogant Colton willing to carry a child he didn't know. Even his usually cold face softened. The nanny saw that and felt glad. Didi seems to love this gentleman. Freya was silent. Didi wasn't afraid of him and really looked like she liked him a lot. When Daisy came over, Didi looked shy, but she seemed to be a lot braver with Colton. Did she think that he was her daddy because Colton was a man? Freya rubbed the bridge of her nose and went over to take Didi back after a moment. "Colton, you can give her back to me and leave." Didi hugged Colton's neck, and it was obvious that she wanted to stick to him. Colton glanced at Freya, and it didn't look like he wanted to hand her over. "She seems to like me a lot." Freya flashed an awkward smile. "She likes everyone and calls them Daddy. Are you interested in becoming her father?" Was that possible? Colton was Colton, and even if Didi loved him like no other, there was no way he would become her father. Even if Colton loved children, he would be the second heir to the Goldman Empire and would need to start his own family. When that happened, Didi would have no place in his life. She was still a child, so she would probably forget about him after a while. Colton glanced at her and at the nanny. "Is she a good girl?" The nanny smiled and said, "Yes, a very good girl. She doesn't make a fuss." She then remembered something and added, "You must be Ms. Pruitt's friend. Why don't you stay for dinner? Didi seems to enjoy your company." Freya was going to decline on his behalf when Colton nodded. "Sure." The nanny was delighted. "All right, I'll go prepare dinner then." Colton carried Didi into the house, following after the nanny. "Thank you." Freya stood frozen in the courtyard, looking flabbergasted. Meanwhile, at the Hilton Villas, Daisy picked up some peas, but didn't seem to be eating properly. She didn't know why she was so concerned. Waylon pushed a bowl of soup in front of her. "Lost your appetite now that you're not at the Knowles mansion?" She coughed and mumbled, "Nonsense." Waylon smiled. "What's on your mind?" Chapter 1819. Daisy pressed her lips together and said, "I was thinking about Colton. I keep feeling that something is off with him." Waylon looked down. "Don't over-analyze it." Daisy received a text from Freya and checked it. The content made her drop her cutlery. Waylon frowned. What's wrong? Daisy was shocked. Colton is having dinner with Freya. Is this really Colton? He must have been possessed. After sending the message to Daisy, Freya pretended to put her phone away and looked toward Colton. Didi sat next to him, enjoying Colton's feeding. He never looked annoyed the entire time, and even though the food was all over Didi's face, he would just wipe it off for her. That scene was odd yet wholesome. Sir, please have your dinner. I can take care of Didi. The nanny walked over and took Didi in her arms, then brought her upstairs. Didi quietly lay her head on the nanny's shoulder. She was well behaved. Only the two of them were left in the living room. Freya looked up at the man sitting across from her and hesitated. Have you carried children before? Colton stared at her. It's not difficult. Freya had nothing to say to that. Was he showing off how smart he was? They really couldn't have a normal conversation. She laid down her cutleries and said, now that you've had dinner, it's time to leave. Colton chuckled. Are you trying to send a guest away? Are you a guest? If I'm not a guest, am I the host then? Freya knew Colton had a silver tongue, so she would lose if they continued arguing. She pressed her palms on the table and stood up. Colton wiped the corners of his mouth when he saw her walking away. How could the host leave before the guest is finished? Freya smirked. I didn't ask you to stay for dinner. Colton slowly replied, Didi did. Do you mind? Freya was rendered speechless. He got up and said, I'm done. She waved her hand. There's the door. Colton stopped and turned to look at her. She seemed to be looking forward to his departure. Unfortunately, she couldn't control whether he stayed or left. In the next instant, he turned and plopped down on the couch. Freya paused. Weren't you leaving? Colton crossed his legs and leaned back. Get me a cup of tea. Colton Goldman, I'm not your maid. You have no right to order me around. Freya looked annoyed. No one was going to serve him. He looked at her and said, getting tea for a guest is basic manners. Freya took a deep breath, suspecting that Colton was doing this to torture her. The nanny came down from upstairs and saw that Colton was still there, so she smiled and asked, would you like some dessert, sir? Colton smiled. I would be delighted. The nanny didn't notice how annoyed Freya was. I'll go prepare some. After the nanny went into the kitchen, Colton raised his eyebrows at Freya. The nanny has better manners than you. Freya's hands balled into fists, and then she released them. She had to calm down because he was Daisy's brother. She couldn't beat him up. She took a deep breath and told him, we don't have tea, only coffee. That works too, replied Colton. Freya made a cup of coffee in the kitchen and brought it to the table. Your coffee, chapter 1820. Colton looked at the coffee bag in the cup and squinted. I don't drink instant coffee. I'm so sorry, we only have instant, said Freya with a smile. The nanny overheard her as she brought fruits and was curious, ma'am, there are coffee beans in the cabinet. I just got them. Freya was rendered speechless. Colton had to hold in his laugh. Ms. Pruitt, is this how you treat your guests? The nanny thought that he was upset, so she said, I'm sorry, sir. Please forgive her. I didn't tell her we got the beans. Let me go brew some for you. Colton was very nice to her. There's no need, thank you. The nanny nodded and left. He picked up a piece of fruit and looked at Freya, who was standing there. I won't hold this against you. Freya turned to walk upstairs. Colton saw her disappear up her stairs and was weirdly unsettled, so he pushed the dish away and left. Freya heard the sound of the car driving away and looked out the window. She didn't see the car in the courtyard, so she drew her blinds. Didi walked in with a teddy bear the same size as her. Auntie, Daddy? Freya walked to her, knelt, and touched her face. Didi, he's not your daddy. You can't call him that, okay? Didi didn't really understand. Even though she had never seen her parents and didn't know what a complete family looked like, how would Freya explain what happened to her parents to her when she grew up? At the college, Daisy paced the bottom floor of the building, waiting for someone. After a while, she rushed forward when she saw Freya walking over. Freya, what happened last night? I should ask you that. Freya was annoyed. Did you tell Colton I was sick? Daisy shook her head. I didn't. She really hadn't told him. Freya was thinking about something. Daisy wasn't thinking, but instead chuckled. But doesn't that mean that Colton doesn't hate you anymore? Freya smiled. He doesn't hate me, more like being careful around me. Daisy didn't understand. Why is he being careful around you? Freya was frank. He thought that I was trying to get to Waylon. Daisy was shocked upon hearing that. Seeing how she was in disbelief, Freya crossed her arms. He suspected I approached you with a motive, and I lived with that, but now he thinks I have intentions with your older brother. He has a high IQ, but I'm afraid his EQ has been fed to the dogs. No, to be fair, even the dogs wouldn't want it. She could deal with it in the past, but not anymore. Daisy looked at her in shock. That was the first time she saw Freya complain about someone, and that someone was her own brother. She knew how annoying Colton's mouth could get. Why else would she be afraid of him? Daisy felt awkward. That's how he is. Please don't mind him. She then added, he's quite a nice person. Of course, he's nice to you and everyone else. Freya shrugged. Maybe he only treats me that way. I know he doesn't like me. She could tell that he treated everyone well other than people who were close to him. However, when it came to her, he acted as if she owed him something, and he would not let it go, no matter what she did.